There's a generation that rarely announces itself. It doesn't dominate headlines, it doesn't trend, it doesn't argue loudly about identity or demand historical recognition. Yet it sits quietly in the middle of modern life, running teams, fixing systems, raising families, and holding institutions together. This is Generation X, and to understand them, you have to understand what it does to a child when no one is watching. They were born into transition, not into prosperity myth or digital saturation, but into a world that felt unstable in subtle, constant ways. Two-income households became normal. Divorce stopped being rare. Institutions that once seemed permanent began to fracture. And many of their formative hours were spent alone, not metaphorically, but literally. An empty house after school is not just a setting, it's an environment that teaches lessons. When you grow up without immediate supervision, you develop a particular internal structure. You learn to regulate yourself because no one else is there to do it. You make decisions without committee meetings. You manage time without reminders. You experience consequences without mediation. That kind of environment wires the brain differently. Instead of expecting rescue, you anticipate risk. Instead of assuming stability, you prepare for interruption. Instead of waiting for instruction, you experiment and adjust. It creates adults who are unusually self-directed, but also unusually guarded. Independence in this context isn't a personality trait, it's a survival adaptation. At the same time, they were watching something else unfold, the erosion of trust and authority. They saw corporations restructure without loyalty. They saw public leaders contradict themselves. They saw experts reverse positions. The lesson absorbed wasn't rage, it was skepticism. Not loud rebellion, but quiet appraisal. For Generation X, respect is earned through competence, not granted through hierarchy. Titles mean little. Skill means everything. If you can do the job, you matter. If you can't, no branding strategy will save you. This is why they often appear unimpressed. It's not apathy, it's filtration. They were trained early to evaluate systems critically because systems kept failing in visible ways. When promises break often enough, optimism becomes inefficient. So they developed something subtler, conditional hope. They expect things to work, but they prepare for them not to. This dual processing, hope and contingency running simultaneously, gives them a particular calm in crisis. When instability hits, they are rarely shocked. They have already simulated the possibility. But this resilience comes with cost. If you are taught early that vulnerability exposes you to loss, you learn to conceal your need for reassurance. Asking for help feels like regression. Public displays of emotion feel excessive. Broadcasting personal details feels risky. That's part of why many of them engage with technology differently. They are fluent in it. They helped build the architecture of the digital age, yet they rarely surrender themselves to it fully. To them, privacy isn't secrecy, it's safety. They remember a time when mistakes faded, when conversations disappeared, when identity could evolve without a permanent archive. So the idea of documenting every thought and misstep feels less like freedom and more like exposure. They watch, they observe, they analyze, but they don't always step into the spotlight. There's another paradox at work. Despite growing up with relative emotional distance, Generation X formed intense peer bonds. When adults were busy or absent, friends filled the vacuum. Loyalty wasn't sentimental, it was practical. You relied on each other because you had to. That practicality matured into a quiet reliability in adulthood. They may not announce support, but they provide it. They may not advertise commitment, but they honor it. Their collaboration is understated, almost invisible. They are often the steady colleague in the background, the manager who fixes a crisis without sending a memo about it, the parent who ensures stability without asking for applause. And applause was never central to their development. Recognition was sporadic,
Praise was limited. Feedback was often corrective rather than celebratory. This shaped a psychology that does not depend heavily on external validation. They don't assume the world owes them attention. They assume the world requires maintenance. Economically, they matured in periods of uncertainty. Market fluctuations, structural layoffs, technological disruption, none of it felt surprising. Many internalized the belief that security is temporary. So they diversified, not always out of ambition, but out of caution. Multiple skills, multiple revenue streams, multiple backup plans. They understand fragility because they witnessed it repeatedly. This creates a generation that is rarely naive about stability. Yet beneath the competence lies something more complex. Growing up self-reliant can blur into isolation. Being capable can turn into refusing support. Emotional restraint can harden into emotional distance. Research consistently shows that members of this cohort are less likely to seek social support during stress compared to both older and younger groups, not because they lack relationships, but because the reflex to handle things alone is deeply embedded. Strength becomes both advantage and barrier. Their relationship with information is equally distinct. They were raised in an era where knowledge required effort. Answers were not instant. You had to search, compare, cross-reference. The friction of acquiring information made it memorable. As a result, they often approach problems with patience. They assume understanding takes time. They don't expect mastery in minutes. This patience can look slow in a hyper-accelerated culture, but it often produces depth. Now they stand between generations that operate differently. Above them, a cohort shaped by post-war expansion and institutional trust. Below them, cohorts shaped by digital immersion and constant connectivity. Generation X functions as a bridge, translating analog intuition into digital systems, skepticism into innovation, solitude into structure. Bridges rarely receive celebration. They are expected to hold weight quietly. And perhaps that is the defining characteristic of this generation: endurance without performance. They do not romanticize struggle, but they are not shocked by it. They do not chase recognition, but they value competence. They do not assume protection, but they offer it. If you want to understand Generation X, don't look for noise, look for continuity. Look for the systems that keep running. Look for the person who anticipated the flaw before it became visible. They are not detached because they don't care. They are careful because they do. They are not pessimistic because they expect disaster. They are prepared because history trained them to be. And in a world increasingly driven by visibility, there is something quietly radical about a generation that measures worth not by attention, but by function. They may never demand a parade, but without them, many of the structures we rely on would quietly fail.